The rain fell in a soft drizzle as Ern adjusted the collar of his coat, waiting on the dimly lit platform of the Earth Alien Relations Terminal. He couldn't help but feel a knot of anticipation tightening in his chest. This wasn't his first time meeting someone from beyond Earth. His work in interspecies diplomacy had ensured he'd seen his share of strange otherworldly beings, but this was different, personal. The assignment wasn't just another diplomatic formality. He sighed, tucking the tablet back into his pocket. Reservations was putting it lightly. According to the briefing, thin culture had cultivated centuries of paranoia about humans, fueled by myths and stories about humanity's wild and uncontrolled reproduction. To them, humans were impulsive, untamed creatures capable of taking what they wanted without hesitation. The thought made Aang chuckle bitterly. If only they knew how little his own life resembled such dramatics. A low hum filled the air as the transport capsule docked, its sleek metallic surface glinting under the platform's fluorescent lights. The hiss of decompressing air was followed by the gentle opening of the capsule door. Aang stood straighter, wiping his damp hands on his coat. A figure emerged, her small frame silhouetted against the capsule's interior light. Neil Core stepped forward cautiously, her luminous eyes darting around the platform as if searching for hidden dangers. Her skin a soft lavender hue shimmered faintly under the lights, and her hair, a sea cascade of silvery strands, flowed down her back like liquid starlight. Delicate ridges lined her cheeks, giving her face an ethereal, almost fragile beauty. Arn offered a tentative smile, but she didn't return it. Instead, her gaze locked onto him, her expression a mixture of suspicion and unease. "You're Arn?" she asked, her voice high and melodic, though tinged with weariness. "That's me," he replied, keeping his tone warm but neutral. "You must be NY. It's an honor to meet you." She didn't respond immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. Her diminutive stature made her look delicate, but the way she held herself, rigid and poised, hinted at a steely resolve beneath the surface. "I was told I'd be staying in your residence," she said at last, her words clipped. "That's right," Erlen said, gesturing toward the exit. "It's not far, just a short ride from here." Neri hesitated before stepping forward, movements deliberate and cautious, as if each step was a calculated risk. Aylin matched her pace, resisting the urge to fill the silence with idle chatter. The ride back to his apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the electric car. Nair sat as far from him as the small vehicle allowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her luminous eyes stared out the window, taking in the unfamiliar cityscape with a mix of curiosity and guardedness. Ern glanced at her briefly before focusing back on the road. "If there's anything you need, just let me know. I want you to feel comfortable." Her head turned sharply toward him, her gaze piercing. "Comfortable?" she echoed, as if the word was foreign. He nodded. "I know this arrangement isn't easy for you. I just want to help." Nair's lips pressed into a thin line. "Help, that's what they all say." Erlen chose not to press further, sensing that any attempt to reassure her would only deepen her mistrust. When they arrived at his apartment, Na hesitated on the threshold, her wide eyes scanning every detail of the space. The room was modest but cozy, with warm lighting, a small kitchen, and a plush sofa facing a large window that offered a view of the city skyline. "This will be your room," Aylin said, leading her to a smaller door off the main living area. Na peeked inside, her expression softening slightly as she took in the neatly made bed, the small desk by the window, and the faintly glowing blue lamp on the nightstand. "It's adequate," she said after a moment, her tone begrudgingly neutral. "I'm glad you think so," Erlen said with a faint smile. "I'll let you get settled. If you need anything, I'll be right out here." She nodded curtly and disappeared into the room, the door clicking shut behind her. The first few days were tense. Nai kept to herself, emerging from her room only when necessary and speaking to Aylin as little as possible. He tried to make her feel welcome, cooking meals he hoped she'd enjoy and giving her space to explore the apartment at her own pace. But every gesture of kindness seemed to deepen her suspicion. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the small dining table, Nai finally broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her fork hovering over a plate of roasted vegetables. "Doing what?" Ern replied, looking up from his own plate. "Being kind," She said the word as if it left a bitter taste in her mouth. "What do you want from me?" Ern set his fork down, meeting her gaze with calm sincerity. "I don't want anything from you now. I'm just trying to make this easier for both of us." Her eyes narrowed. "Easier? You think you can erase centuries of mistrust with vegetables?" Erilyn chuckled softly. "I know it's not that simple, but trust has to start somewhere, doesn't it?" Neri didn't respond, her gaze dropping to her plate. For a moment, the tension in the air seemed to ease, but it was short-lived. "You should know," she said suddenly, her voice sharp, "that I won't let you mate with me." Erilyn blinked, caught off guard by her bluntness. That's not what this is about, isn't it?" she countered, her eyes narrowing. "Your kind is known for it. You take what you want." He leaned back in his chair, his expression softening nearer. "I'm not sure what you've been told about humans, but that's not who I am. I'm here to help you, not to hurt you." Her expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly masked it with a scowl. "We'll see." Late that night, Ern sat on the sofa staring out at the city lights. He could still hear Na's words echoing in his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder what it would take to earn her trust in her room. Na sat by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. For the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that not all humans were the monsters she'd been taught to fear, but trust, she reminded herself, was a dangerous thing. The days stretched on, filled with an awkward dance of avoidance and tentative gestures of civility. Erin and Na shared the same space, yet the distance between them felt insurmountable each time Erilyn tried to bridge the gap. Nair's defenses flared up like a shield, pushing him back, but there were small cracks in her armor. One morning, as Aelin sipped his coffee and scrolled through reports on his tablet, he heard a soft shuffle behind him. He glanced over his shoulder to see Na standing in the kitchen doorway, her lavender skin catching the morning light. She was clutching a small, empty cup in her hands. I don't know how to use this," she admitted, holding the cup out awkwardly. Erilyn blinked, then smiled gently. "You want some coffee?" She tilted her head, her luminous eyes narrowing. "Coffee, it's a human drink," he explained, rising from his chair. "Some people call it liquid motivation." May watched wearily as he poured a small amount into her cup. When he handed it back to her, she sniffed it cautiously, her ridged nose crinkling. "It smells burnt." Erin chuckled. "It's an acquired taste. Try it." She hesitated, her gaze flicking to him, as if suspecting a trick. Then, with a deep breath, she brought the cup to her lips and took a tentative sip. Her reaction was immediate, her face scrunched up in a look of pure disgust, and she thrust the cup back toward him. "It's awful. How do humans drink this?" Arn laughed, taking the cup from her. "Not everyone likes it. But hey, at least you tried," and huffed, crossing her arms. "Your species has strange tastes." "Fair enough," Arn said with a grin. "I'll make some tea instead. That might suit you better." For a moment, Neri said nothing, her expression guarded, but as Arn busied himself with a kettle, she lingered in the kitchen, her posture less tense than usual. Their interactions continued to evolve, albeit slowly. Na's curiosity about human culture began to override her suspicion, though she was careful to hide it. She asked questions in passing about the books stacked on Arn's shelves, the music playing softly in the background, and the curious devices that filled his apartment. Erilyn, sensing her growing interest, answered her question patiently, never pressing for more than she was willing to give. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Aelin on the sofa and Nye perched stiffly in an armchair, she finally broke the silence. "Do humans always live like this?" she asked, gesturing vaguely around the room. "Like what?" Arn asked, setting down his book alone. She clarified, her tone neutral, but her expression pensive. Erin hesitated. "Not always. Some people live with family, others with friends or partners. It depends." Nair tilted her head, her silvery hair catching the light. "And you, why do you live alone?" The question caught him off guard. He rubbed the back of his neck, searching for the right words. "I guess I've just gotten used to it. My work keeps me busy, and well, I haven't found anyone I'd want to share my space with." She studied him intently, her luminous eyes narrowing slightly. "You seem lonely." Ern chuckled softly, though the sound lacked humor. "I suppose I am sometimes. But that's life, isn't it? We make do." Nair's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she seemed to see him not as a representative of humanity, but as an individual flawed and vulnerable. As the days turned into weeks, their uneasy coexistence began to shift into something resembling companionship. Na still kept her distance, but her sharp-edged edges softened, and her mistrust gave way to a cautious openness. One afternoon, as they walked through a nearby park, Aylin, hoping the fresh air would help ease her restlessness, Na paused by a small pond, her gaze fixed on the rippling water. Aylin, she said softly, we have something like this, but the water is violet, and it glows under the moons. Ern smiled, stepping up beside her. That sounds beautiful, it is, she murmured, her voice tinged with longing. I didn't think I'd miss it, but I do. He glanced at her, noting the way her shoulders slumped, and her usually guarded expression softened. It's hard being so far from home. Na nodded, her eyes never leaving the water. Humans aren't the only ones who feel lonely. It seemed her admission hung in the air, fragile and unspoken. Aylin resisted the urge to say something reassuring, sensing that silence was the better response. After a moment, she turned to him, her luminous eyes searching his face. You're not what I expected. He raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? Someone greedy, she admitted. Arrogant, dangerous. And what do you think now? Her lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. I'm still deciding. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Nair surprised him by picking up one of his books. She held it delicately, as if it might crumb in her hands, and flipped through the pages with wide-eyed curiosity. What's this one about? She asked, holding it up. Aylin smiled. That's a collection of human poetry. It's hard to explain. Poetry is about feelings, mostly emotions and experiences that can't always be described in plain words. Nair frowned, her brow furrowing. Feelings like sadness sometimes, he said, leaning forward, but also happiness, love, longing, anything. Really? She stared at the book for a long moment before setting it down carefully. Humans are more complicated than I thought. Ern chuckled. We're all complicated. Nay, humans, tell her, and everyone. She didn't respond, but the look in her eyes was thoughtful. Later that night, as Ern lay in bed, he couldn't help but replay the day events in his mind. Slowly but surely, Na was letting her walls down. Each small moment of connection felt like a victory, and though he knew it would take time, he was determined to show her that not all humans were the monsters she'd been taught to fear. In her own room, Na sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something close, and it terrified her. The first tangible shift between Aylin and Nair came in the form of shared laughter, a sound that startled both of them. It was a quiet evening with a faint hum of city life filtering in through the windows. Ern was attempting to explain the human concept of comedy to Na, who listened with her typical blend of skepticism and curiosity. So he began, trying to keep a straight face. There's this joke, what do you call a fish with no eyes? Nair tilted her head, her luminous eyes narrowing. A fish? Is this another human metaphor? No, Aylin said, holding up a hand. It's a joke, just listen. What do you call a fish with no eyes? For a moment, there was silence. Nair stared at him, as though he'd spoken in another language. Then, unexpectedly, a soft musical sound escaped her lips, a laugh, unguarded and genuine. Aylin blinked. Wait, are you laughing? Nair immediately straightened her expression, snapping back to its usual guarded state. No, you are, he teased, his grin widening. You laughed at my terrible joke. I did not, she insisted, though her cheeks took on a faint silvery blush. Your humor is ridiculously effective. Apparently, he countered, leaning back with a smug expression. Despite her protests, the faint smile lingering on Nair's lips betrayed her. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. A crack in the wall she so carefully constructed. As the days passed, those cracks grew wider. Nair's curiosity about human life became more evident, and Aylin found himself enjoying the role of her reluctant guide. She asked questions that ranged from practical to deeply philosophical, her perspective often forcing him to reconsider things he'd taken for granted. One afternoon, as they walked through the bustling marketplace near Ern's apartment, Na paused in front of a stall selling handmade jewelry. Her gaze lingered on a delicate pendant, shaped like a star, its surface inlaid with tiny shimmering stones. What's this for? She asked, picking it up. It's jewelry, Erilyn explained humans wear it as decoration, or as a way to express themselves decoration. She turned the pendant over in her hands, her brow furrowing. It serves no purpose, not everything has to have a purpose, he said with a shrug. Sometimes it's enough for something to just be beautiful. Neri fell silent, her gaze fixed on the pendant. After a moment she set it back down and moved on, but her expression remained thoughtful. Their conversations grew deeper, touching on topics Erilyn never expected to discuss with an alien companion. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Neri broke the comfortable silence with a question that caught him off guard. Do humans ever regret their existence? Erilyn frowned, setting down his drink. What do you mean, Auntie Cellere? She began, her voice soft. We are taught that every life has a purpose, but here your world seems so chaotic, so uncertain. Do you ever wonder if it's all meaningless? The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. He considered her question carefully before answering. Sometimes, he admitted, there are moments when everything feels overwhelming, like nothing makes sense, but I think that's part of being human. We don't have all the answers, but we keep searching for them anyway. Nay tilted her head, her luminous eyes reflecting the city lights. That sounds exhausting, Arn chuckled. It is, but it's also what makes life worth living. I think the not knowing, the possibility of discovering something new. She regarded him in silence, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, he leaned back in her chair and sighed. Perhaps humans are not so different from Telleran. After all, their growing bond didn't go unnoticed. On more than one occasion, Aelin caught passers-by casting curious or outright disapproving glances at them. The sight of a human and a Talon together was still a rarity, and it drew attention whether they wanted it or not. One evening, as they walked back to the apartment after dinner, a group of teenagers loitering on the sidewalk sneered at them. Hey, isn't that one of those alien freaks? One of them called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Ern's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Na stepped forward. Her posture was calm, but there was a quiet intensity in her eyes that silenced the group immediately. Do all humans fear what they do not understand? She asked, her voice steady, but laced with quiet disdain. The teenagers exchanged uneasy glances before muttering excuses and retreating down the street. Arn exhaled slowly. That was impressive. Neri turned to him, her expression neutral. Your species is brash, but easily intimidated. Not all of us, he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. She raised an eyebrow. No, I suppose not. The incident marked a turning point in their relationship. Na began to trust Ern in ways she hadn't before, confiding in him about her fears and her struggles to adjust to life on Earth. In return, he shared stories of his own, of his childhood, his dreams, and the moments that had shaped him. One night, as they sat together on the couch, Na surprised him by asking about his family. They're gone, he said after a moment, his voice quiet. It's just me now. Her gaze softened. I'm sorry, that must be difficult. It is, he admitted, but I've learned to live with it, and having you here, it helps in a way. Her cheeks flushed with that faint silvery hue again, and she looked away. You are unexpectedly kind for a human. Don't let it get to your head, he teased. Though his smile was warm for the first time, she smiled back, a small fleeting expression, but genuine nonetheless. Later that evening, as they prepared to turn in for the night, Na paused at the doorway to her room. She glanced back at Ern, who was tidying up the living room, and hesitated. Ern, she said softly. He looked up, surprised by the use of his name. Yeah, thank you. He tilted his head, confused. For what? For being patient with me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ern's smile was gentle. Anytime. Na. As she disappeared into her room, Aelin couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time, it seemed that the barriers between them were beginning to crumble, and he was determined to see where that path would lead. The nights between Aelin and Nur had begun to change in subtle but profound ways. Their conversations had deepened, and the walls that had once divided them were now mere shadows of their former selves. Na, who had initially maintained a cautious distance, was slowly allowing herself to open up to Aelin, her guard gradually slipping away, and though neither of them fully acknowledged it, a new connection was budding, something neither alien nor human had expected. It was a quiet evening when the change became undeniable. Ern sat in his usual spot by the window, gazing out over the city. The lights below flickered like distant stars. their warm glow a contrast to the cold silence that seemed to surround him. He could hear Na moving about the apartment, the soft rustle of fabric, as she prepared for bed. As he turned his gaze back to the streets below, a thought crossed his mind, one that had been swirling for days, a lingering question that refused to be ignored. Why am I letting her in? His life had been solitary for so long, his connections fleeting and superficial, but Nair was different. She was alien, yes, but there was something about her that made him feel connected, as if their differences were just pieces of a puzzle, each one making the other whole. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, a mixture of curiosity, concern, and something deeper, something more dangerous. Suddenly, Nair's voice broke through his reverie. Arn, can we talk? She asked, her tone softer than usual. He turned toward her, startled by the vulnerability in her voice. He nodded and gestured to the empty seat next to him. Of course. What's on your mind? She hesitated for a moment before walking over and sitting down beside him. The air between them felt heavier tonight, charged with an unspoken energy that neither of them could quite grasp. Nye shifted uncomfortably, folding her hands in her lap. I've been thinking, she began, her gaze fixed on her hands rather than him, about what you said the other day about humans not always needing a purpose for everything. Erlen nodded, his curiosity piqued. And what about it? She took a deep breath, her voice tentative. I don't understand here. Everything seems so random. You don't have a grand purpose like we do on Talaret. There's no structure, no order, it's just chaos. And you still find meaning in it. Ern's eyes softened. It's not always easy, he said quietly. Sometimes it feels like we're all just stumbling through life trying to make sense of it. But I think meaning is something you find, not something that's given to you. Her gaze met his, and for a moment the world outside seemed to fall away. That sounds hard, she murmured. Ern smiled faintly, his voice low. It is, but it's also what makes it worth it, the challenge, the discovery. Nan nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. There was a silence between them, then a silence filled with unspoken words. Eren could feel the weight of her emotions, her uncertainty pressing against him. He didn't know what she was thinking, but he knew one thing for sure: she had come a long way since she first arrived that night. As they sat in the dimly lit room, something shifted between them. Nye, in her quiet way, was beginning to trust him, and Arn, despite his own reservations, found that he wanted to be there for her more than he had ever anticipated. As the evening stretched on, the two of them found themselves talking less and less. Instead, they were simply there, sitting side by side in the warm glow of the apartment, their proximity growing comfortable. It was then that Na made a small tentative movement that caused Ern's heart to race. She reached out her delicate hand, hovering just inches from his. Aelin froze, unsure whether to pull away or to embrace the moment. He could feel her hesitating, her uncertainty mirroring his own. Yet the longer he sat there, the more he realized that this connection they were building was inevitable. With a breath, he extended his hand toward hers, and in that fleeting moment of contact, something electric passed between them. Her skin was smooth and warm beneath his touch, and the way her fingers curled around his felt both familiar and foreign at once. Nair's gaze flickered to his, her lips parting slightly as though she were unsure of what to say or what to do next. Erlen swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest. Nah, she didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. There was a quiet understanding between them, now one that had taken weeks to form, but only moments to solidify. She was no longer the distant, untouchable alien she had once been. She was someone he cared for deeply, inexplicably, and the fear that had once lingered in her eyes, the hesitation that marked her every movement, had faded, replaced by something else: curiosity, desire. I don't know what this means, Nair whispered, her voice barely audible, but I want to find out. With you? Ern's breath hitched. He had no words to respond, only the overwhelming urge to lean closer, to close the gap between them. Slowly, carefully, he moved until their lips brushed, tentative, unsure, yet undeniable. The moment their lips met, a flood of emotions surged through both of them: desire, tenderness, longing, and the shared vulnerability of two beings from completely different worlds coming together. Nair's hand slid up to rest against his chest, her touch gentle but firm. As she deepened the kiss, Arn responded in kind, his own hand tracing the curve of her arm, feeling the pulse beneath her skin. For a long, while they lost themselves in the kiss, the world outside fading away when they finally broke apart breathless and dazed. They shared a quiet, knowing smile. Does this mean? Started her voice soft, but filled with an unspoken question. Erlen nodded, his gaze steady. Yes, it means that I want this too, whatever this is. And in that moment they both knew that the road ahead would be uncertain, filled with challenges neither of them had ever anticipated. But as long as they were together, they would face it head-on, unafraid, unashamed, and more connected than ever before. Days passed, and with each one Aelin and Ner found themselves drawn closer together in ways that neither of them had anticipated. What had started as a tentative friendship had morphed into something far more profound. The space between them, once filled with awkward silence and miscommunication, had been replaced with a silent understanding, a connection that transcended words. They spent their days in each other's company, learning more about one another with every passing hour. For Erlen, Ner's alien presence was no longer strange. She had become a part of his daily life, her unique culture, her history, and her way of thinking woven into the fabric of his world. For Na Earth and its inhabitants had stopped being a foreign concept to navigate the fear she had once carried. The fear of being judged, of being seen as an object of curiosity, had faded, replaced by a growing sense of acceptance. The first time Nye allowed herself to lean on him, truly lean on him, was a moment neither of them would ever forget. It was a typical evening when the air between them shifted yet again, this time with an intensity that made their hearts beat faster in their chests. Neri had been working on some device she had brought from Tellera, an intricate piece of technology that fascinated Aelin. She had become determined to understand it, to integrate it with Earth's more primitive tech. But as she sat hunched over the device on the table, Erlen noticed the way her fingers were trembling. It wasn't the usual gentle shake of frustration. This was something different. This was exhaustion. She had been working non-stop for days, never resting for more than a few hours at a time. Arn had watched her from the couch, his mind busy with thoughts about how to approach the situation. He knew she was tired, but she refused to admit it, always pushing forward, as if her drive could overcome the physical limitations of her alien body. He stood, walking quietly over to where she sat, and without a word gently placed his hands on her shoulders. At his touch, Na stiffened for a moment. But when she turned to face him, there was something in her eyes that softened her usual resolve. The weight of everything, the uncertainty, the fear, the long days seemed to fall from her shoulders like a heavy cloak. I don't need to rest, Nair whispered, her voice small. I can keep going. Erlen didn't respond right away, choosing instead to kneel beside her. He lifted her chin gently, his thumb brushing across the soft skin of her cheek. You've been working nonstop for days. Your body is telling you to stop, even if your mind isn't. He saw the brief flash of resistance in her eyes, the deep-set belief that she must always remain strong. But then, as though the weight of his touch was breaking down the walls she had built around herself, Nye, the tension in her shoulders melting. Maybe, she admitted, her voice low, maybe you're right. Without another word, Ern carefully helped her to her feet and guided her to the couch. Nod let him. She didn't protest, didn't fight him. There was no more hesitation between them, just the silent understanding that in this moment it was okay to let someone else take the lead. As they sat together, Nair's head gradually came to rest on Arn's shoulder. It was a simple act, one that seemed so natural in the silence of the room, but it was a powerful shift in their relationship. Nair allowed herself to fully trust Arn, not just with her body, but with her vulnerability. It was as though the emotional distance that had once existed between them had been bridged, and they had crossed it without either of them even realizing it. Her hand, once so guarded, now rested against his chest, her fingers curling around the fabric of his shirt. Ern's heart beat faster as he absorbed the tenderness of the moment. Her touch, so soft and yet so meaningful, made something stir inside of him, a feeling that had no name but one that both delighted and frightened him. Nair looked up at him, her gaze intense and searching. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, a silent question she had been asking for days, but had never quite voiced. "Is this real?" Arn didn't need to answer. He simply brushed a strand of hair from her face and leaned in to kiss her. It was gentle at first, slow, as though they were testing the waters. But soon the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate. Their hands moved instinctively, exploring, learning, mapping the new terrain of each other's skin. Nair's body reacted in ways she hadn't anticipated, her pulse quickening, her breath coming in soft gasps. She had always kept a part of herself sealed away, afraid of letting anyone get too close, afraid of what might happen if she allowed herself to give in. But here, with Aelin, that fear had dissolved, and for the first time Nair felt herself truly living in the moment, giving herself over to the experience without hesitation. Arn's hands were gentle but firm. As they cued her face, pulling her closer, she melted into his embrace, their bodies pressing together, the world outside their shared space fading into insignificance. The intensity of the kiss spoke volumes, an unspoken declaration of everything they had been dancing around for weeks. When they finally broke up, part breathless and flushed, Nair rested her forehead against his. Neither of them said anything. There was no need. The silence spoke louder than any words could have. In that moment, their connection had reached a new, deeper level, a place where vulnerability, trust, and passion intertwined, creating something uniquely theirs. Nair smiled, her breath still shaky as she looked into Ern's eyes. "I didn't know I could feel this free." Ern's heart swelled at the honesty in her voice. "You are free, and so am I." The night stretched on, their moments together becoming an ongoing exploration of their newfound bond. Each kiss, each touch, each whispered word was an affirmation of what they had found together, something far beyond what either of them had imagined. The days that followed were marked by a profound shift. No longer just two beings from different worlds, Ern and Nair had become something more, partners, equals, in a way they had never anticipated. They learned from one another, their lives interwoven in a way that transcended culture, species, and the vast distance between their origins. Ern knew Nair in ways he had never known anyone before. Her quiet strength, her fierce intelligence, and the deep vulnerability she had so carefully guarded for so long. And Nair in turn had learned to trust and understand Aelin in ways she hadn't thought possible. His kindness, his genuine care for her well-being, had slowly melted away the walls she had built around her heart, walls erected by fear and years of hiding from the world. They were no longer merely the alien and the human. They were two beings who had found each other when they least expected it, who had given each other something neither of them could have found alone, a kind of peace, a sense of belonging. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world outside their shared homes settled into the quiet of twilight, Arn and Nair stood together on the balcony, their fingers entwined. The cool breeze from the evening sky brushed against their skin, carrying with it the scent of the earth, of life, and of the future. "I never thought I would be here," Nair said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as she stared out at the unfamiliar yet peaceful view. "With you on Earth, and yet it feels right." Arn smiled, a slow, contented curve of his lips. He gently squeezed her hand, bringing her gaze back to him. "The universe has a way of bringing things together when the time is right," he said, his voice warm. "When it's meant to be." Nair turned to face him fully, her expression serious yet softened by the years of hesitation and fear that had now been replaced with something far more beautiful, trust. She had learned what it meant to love, and to be loved in return, to let go of the fear of the unknown, to step into the vast and uncharted territory of her heart. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly, "afraid of what it meant, of what could happen if I let someone in. I thought you would see me as different, as something strange, something you couldn't truly accept. But I was wrong. You didn't just accept me, Arn. You saw me, really saw me." Aelin reached up, gently cupping her face in his hands. His eyes were filled with tenderness, his thumb brushing over her cheek with the softest of touches. "I don't see a difference, and I only see you, the person I care about, the person I want to build a future with, no barriers, no boundaries." The air between them was heavy with emotion, the words spoken not merely as promises, but as truths they both carried in their hearts. Nair stepped forward, pressing herself against him, her body fitting against his like the final piece of a puzzle. She closed her eyes, her forehead resting against his. She felt the warmth of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the most beautiful feeling she had ever known, the safety of being truly seen, of being truly understood. "I don't need to be afraid anymore," she murmured the words, a silent vow, "not with you." Ern's arms wrapped around her, holding her close, his heart swelling with a sense of peace he had never thought possible. They stood there together in a fading light, holding each other not as alien and human, but as two souls who had found a place to belong together. And in that moment, as the stars began to appear overhead, they both knew that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. There was no more fear, no more hesitation. They had discovered something far more powerful than the differences that had once separated them. They had discovered the beauty of what it meant to truly connect, to truly love, despite the vastness of space-time and everything that could have kept them apart. The night wrapped around them, but it didn't feel cold anymore. It was warm, with possibility, warm with a promise of a future they would build together, one where love and acceptance were the foundation, and where differences that had once seemed so vast no longer mattered. The universe had brought them together, and now it was up to them to chart their own course, and so they did together.